In the dusty afternoon of Sweetwater Creek, a young orphan was thrown out of the general store. He fell to the ground, clutching his empty stomach, listening to the door slam shut behind him. A cold, final sound, as if the whole world had just turned its back on him. But across the street, a man stopped walking. His coat was covered in trail dust, his eyes heavy and quiet, like a dying sunset. He looked at the boy for a long moment, then said softly, "I care. Always." No one knew that those 3 words would bind 3 lost souls into one journey, a journey where kindness and loneliness would collide, and from that collision, something beautiful would be born, a family. If you believe that sometimes a single sentence can save an entire life, stay with me and listen to the rest of the story. Share how this made you feel, and tell us where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss another story about kindness, hope, and the quiet miracles that still live in this world. The evening light in Sweetwater Creek carried a color that could break a man's heart. Gold draining into red, red fading into dust. The wind came low from the plains, pushing a soft haze across the single main street where boards creaked, signs swayed, and the day slowly folded itself shut. The smell of horses and old timber hung in the air. Somewhere, a bell clanged as a storekeeper turned the key in his door. It was the kind of evening that belonged to endings, not beginnings. By the wall of the general store sat a boy no one wanted to see. His name was Emmett, 10 years old, small for his age, with a shock of light brown hair clinging to his forehead, and a face that had learned silence too early. His shirt was too big, his trousers too short, both stiff with dust. The soles of his shoes had long given up, the toes gaping like mouths that had forgotten laughter. He hugged his knees tightly, chin buried, as if trying to make himself smaller than the hunger that gnawed inside him. His lips were dry and cracked, but even so, he whispered a sound, something between a sigh and a prayer. Inside the store, a man was sweeping sawdust and muttering about vagabonds and trouble. He was round and red-faced, wearing a greasy apron that had seen more years than kindness. When his eyes fell on the boy outside, something hard flickered there. He stepped out, broom in hand, his voice sharp as gravel. "Get away from my wall, you little orphan. Go on, before I call the sheriff." The boy didn't move at first. He stared at the ground, where the last bit of sunlight slipped between the cracks of the boards. "Please, sir," he said quietly, "I'm not hurting anyone." But the shopkeeper's reply was a shove of words, bitter and final. "You're bad luck. Go beg somewhere else." The door slammed behind him with a sound that felt heavier than it should have. Across the street, a man had stopped beside his horse. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his boots heavy with trail dust from weeks of riding. His coat was the faded brown of the desert floor, his hat tilted low over eyes that had seen too much road and too little peace. Thunder Davidson, that was his name, though few called him by it. To most, he was just that cowboy from the northern range, the one who rode alone and spoke less than the wind. He watched as the boy pushed himself up and brushed the dirt from his knees, pride still flickering beneath the grime. There was something in the way the child refused to beg, something that reached into Thunder's memory like an old thorn. Sharp, unexpected, but familiar. He remembered another night, another boy, crouched behind a saloon, stealing bread because no one else would feed him. He remembered the man who found him then, not with anger, but with mercy. Thunder loosened the reins, meaning to walk on, but then he heard it, so faint it might have been lost to the dust. The boy's voice. "Nobody cares." He froze. The words hung in the air like smoke. Nobody cares. It wasn't a complaint. It was resignation, the kind of truth a child should never have to know. Thunder turned slowly. His shadow stretched long across the dirt street, touching the boy before he did. He crossed the road, each step steady and deliberate, the spurs at his heels whispering instead of ringing. The boy flinched when the shadow fell over him, expecting another scolding, another door to close. But Thunder didn't shout. He didn't reach for his belt or point to the street. He simply crouched down so his eyes met the boy's. For a moment, neither spoke. The town behind them was quiet except for the lazy creak of the signpost and the far cry of a train somewhere down the valley. "You're wrong, son," Thunder said, his voice low and rough from dust and years. "Somebody does care." The boy blinked, uncertain if he'd heard right. "Who?" Thunder's eyes softened beneath the brim of his Stetson. "I do," he said quietly. "Always." Something shifted in the space between them, a stillness that wasn't silence but recognition. The boy didn't thank him. He didn't know how. He just looked at the man, trying to decide whether kindness was real or another trick played by hunger. Thunder stood again, his movements calm, and offered no more words. He wasn't a man who believed in speeches. He believed in actions, the kind that lasted longer than talk. But even so, as he turned toward his horse, he felt the weight of that moment settle inside him, deeper than the dust, older than the road. The street had emptied now. Lamps were being lit in the windows, little pockets of gold against the dark. Thunder paused, glancing back once. The boy was still there, his thin arms wrapped around himself, but his eyes were no longer on the ground. They followed the cowboy, uncertain but curious, as if trying to memorize the shape of a promise. At the hitching post, Thunder stroked the neck of his mare, a chestnut with a white blaze down her nose, patient and gentle as the evening breeze. "Easy, girl," he murmured, though his gaze remained on the boy. He thought of the long trail north, of the empty bunkhouse waiting at his ranch, of how quiet it had become since the last hand left. He wasn't sure what impulse made him stay, only that leaving suddenly felt wrong. Behind him, the saloon doors flapped once, letting out a burst of laughter and the clink of glasses. The world went on as if nothing had happened, but Thunder knew something had. The boy took a hesitant step forward, his voice small but steady. "Mister, why'd you say that?" Thunder looked over his shoulder, the brim of his hat catching the lamplight. "Say what?" "That you care." The words came out almost in disbelief. The cowboy's expression didn't change much, but a faint curve touched his mouth, a smile that wasn't joy, just understanding. "Because someone once cared for me when I didn't think anyone would. Guess I'm just paying it forward." The boy didn't answer. He seemed to weigh those words, to turn them over like a coin in his mind, testing their truth. The air between them thickened with unspoken things, fear, hope, disbelief, all tangled together like the roots of a stubborn tree. A woman passed by with a basket of laundry, glancing at them but saying nothing. The lamps glowed brighter, the night pressing close. Thunder stepped toward his horse again, ready to mount. But the boy's voice stopped him once more, quiet and trembling, yet clear enough to reach him through the dark. Why would a stranger care? Thunder froze mid-step, the question slicing through the stillness, like the first crack of thunder before a storm. He didn't turn around this time. His hand rested on the saddle horn, his jaw tight. There was no answer easy enough to give. Not yet. The wind picked up, sweeping dust down the street, carrying the smell of sage and rain. The boy's words lingered behind him, small but heavy with meaning. Somewhere far out on the plains, lightning flashed, a brief silver vein across the sky, gone as quickly as it came. And in that flicker of light, Thunder Davidson closed his eyes for a moment, whispering to the wind as if to someone he'd lost long ago. "Because, boy," he said under his breath, "nobody should have to learn that the world doesn't care." But he didn't speak it aloud. Not yet. The door of the general store creaked again, then closed for good. The street settled into quiet. Thunder mounted his horse and rode slowly toward the edge of town, not realizing that with each hoofbeat fading into the dusk, something new had begun, something that would one day bind him, the boy, and another heart yet to come into a single story of mercy and belonging. And behind him, sitting under the glow of a flickering lamp, Emmett watched until the rider became a shadow, and the shadow became dust. Then, with the smallest whisper of hope, he said again, "Why would a stranger care?" The wind carried no answer. Not yet. Night was settling over the Texas plains, the kind of night that came softly but stayed heavy. The wind had cooled, and the lanterns in the windows of Sweetwater flickered like tired eyes. Far beyond town, where the dirt road curved past a line of cottonwoods, the orphanage stood, a long, narrow building of gray clapboard and worn shutters. Inside, the echoes of supper still clung to the air. tin plates clattering, small voices fading into whispers. In one of the upstairs rooms, Margaret O'Sullivan folded a dress into a carpet bag. She moved slowly, each fold deliberate, as though neatness could somehow steady her heart. She was 32, tall and graceful in a way that had nothing to do with wealth. Her strength was quiet, her kindness visible in the corners of her tired smile. Her auburn hair, once bright as polished copper, was tied back with a strip of faded ribbon. A few loose strands brushed her cheeks. The lamplight deepened the shadows under her eyes that carried both gentleness and exhaustion. She had been dismissed that morning. Too soft on the children, the board had said. Too soft, as if compassion were a flaw, as if tenderness had no place among the abandoned. The headmaster, Mr. Hanley, had barely met her eyes when he handed over the letter. He was a thin man with polished boots and an unbending back. His words always clipped, his heart seemingly absent. "You'll find employment elsewhere, Miss O'Sullivan," he'd said coldly. "This establishment requires discipline, not sentiment." Margaret had not argued. There was no point. But as she packed now, her thoughts were not of herself. They were of Emmett Rowe, the boy who had run away 3 nights ago, the same boy she had once stayed up late comforting after a nightmare. The boy who hid extra bread in his pocket so smaller children could eat. She had warned Hanley he was frightened, not defiant. The man had called Emmett ungrateful trash. She had called him a child. The word still echoed in her chest like a bell rung for mercy. Downstairs, the hall smelled faintly of soap and ash. The sound of children settling in their bunks rose and fell like waves. Margaret buttoned her coat, blew out the lamp, and lifted her lantern. The faint light painted a golden trail on the floorboards as she walked toward the door. Her shoes tapped softly, careful not to wake the little ones. She hesitated at the threshold. Behind her were the walls she had tried to fill with laughter, the place where her stories once kept fear away for a few hours each night. Ahead lay the road, dark, uncertain, but free. She stepped out into the wind. The air smelled of rain that might never come. Crickets called from the grass. She tightened her grip on the lantern handle and began walking toward town. Her carpetbag swung lightly at her side, bumping against her skirt with each step. Then came a small voice behind her, thin and trembling. "Miss O'Sullivan!" She turned. A little girl was running down the orphanage steps, bare feet padding against the dirt. Her name was Lucy, no more than 6 years old, with hair the color of wheat and a patched blue dress that hung crookedly from one shoulder. In her arms, she clutched a worn rag doll missing an eye. Margaret set the lantern down and crouched as the child ran into her arms. Lucy's breath came in quick sobs against her coat. "Who'll tell us stories now?" the girl cried. Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, holding the child tighter than she meant to. She smelled the faint scent of soap in Lucy's hair and the ache of loss she'd tried to keep from the children. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but soft, the way it always was when she told bedtime tales. "If I can't protect you inside those walls," she whispered, "then I'll do it from the outside." Lucy looked up at her, puzzled but comforted, and reached out to touch the ribbon in Margaret's hair. "Will you come back?" she asked. "Someday," Margaret said, "when the time is right." The wind tugged at her coat as she rose. She brushed a tear from Lucy's cheek, then handed her the lantern for a moment. The small flame wavered between them, fragile but bright. "Take this back inside," she said gently. "Keep it burning till morning." Lucy nodded solemnly and turned toward the building. Margaret watched until the child disappeared through the doorway. The light inside flickered once, then steadied. Alone again, she picked up her bag and started down the dirt road toward Sweetwater. The prairie spread wide and endless on both sides, silvered under the rising moon. Each step stirred small ghosts of dust. Her thoughts wandered to the boy, where he might be, whether he was safe, whether anyone had stopped to notice him. The lantern swayed in her hand, casting long shadows over the ground. For the first time in days, Margaret allowed herself to whisper his name. Emmett. The sound of it broke something loose in her chest. She pressed a hand over her heart, as if to hold it together. Behind her, unseen, a horse's hoof struck the dirt, soft, deliberate, distant. Thunder Davidson rode slowly along the ridge above the road, He had not meant to follow, yet something in that moment by the general store had kept him from leaving town. The boy's question, "Why would a stranger care?" still lingered in his mind like smoke that refused to fade. When he'd seen the woman walking with a lantern, her coat snapping in the wind, he had recognized her instantly. He had seen her once before, at the small white chapel on the edge of town, the only one that still rang its bell on Sundays. She had sat 2 pews ahead of him, head bowed, hands folded, the posture of someone who prayed not for herself, but for others. He remembered thinking she looked both breakable and unbreakable at once. From his saddle, Thunder watched her now. The moonlight caught her hair, setting it aglow against the darkness. He stayed back, his mare stepping quietly, her hooves muffled by the sand. There was no reason to approach, no right to intrude, yet he couldn't quite ride away either. Margaret reached the bridge that crossed the shallow creek, the water glinting faintly beneath her lantern's glow. The night air hummed with insects and the far call of a coyote. She paused there, tightening her coat against the cold. In her mind, she was already planning what to do next, where to search, whom to ask. She didn't yet know that fate had already placed her answer behind her, astride a horse, watching with quiet respect. The lantern's flame fluttered, shrinking low in the gust that swept up from the creek bed. Margaret cupped her hand around it, shielding the fragile light. "Not tonight," she murmured. "Please stay." The wick steadied again, a small victory against the wind. Thunder saw the gesture and smiled faintly to himself. A woman who fought the wind to protect a flame. That told him more about her than 100 words ever could. He tipped his hat lower and let his voice drop into the wind, barely above a breath. "Maybe she's the one who'll understand." The words vanished into the night, carried off toward the faint glow of Sweetwater ahead, toward a meeting neither of them yet knew was waiting. The night had deepened over Sweetwater Creek, laying a soft veil of moonlight across the empty streets. The lamps along Main flickered in the wind, their glow trembling against the glass. A stray dog nosed through the dust, the smell of stew and tobacco drifting faintly from Mabel's hotel, the only place in town that still had warmth after dark. Inside, the wooden floor creaked with the slow rhythm of weary boots, the murmur of voices low and easy, the clink of spoons against tin bowls steady as a heartbeat. At a corner table near the stove, Thunder Davidson sat opposite the boy he had found by the store just hours earlier. The heat from the fire made the lines of dust on his coat fade to shadow, and the flickering lamplight softened the rugged planes of his face. In front of Emmett Rowe was a bowl of steaming beef stew, the kind that smelled like comfort and home, and everything he'd been missing. The boy had insisted he wasn't hungry, but the lie had lasted less than a minute. Now he was on his 3rd bowl, spoons scraping the bottom, cheeks flushed from the warmth. Thunder said nothing, just watched quietly, the corner of his mouth lifting every so often. When the boy finally slowed, breathing hard between mouthfuls, he looked up as if expecting to be scolded, but the cowboy only pushed his glass of water toward him. "Easy now," Thunder said, his voice low and calm. "Food's not going anywhere." Emmett nodded, wiping his mouth with the back of his sleeve. "Ain't had anything that good I don't know." His voice cracked, the words trailing off. Thunder leaned back in his chair. "Well, that's settled then. You eat when you're hungry, you rest when you're tired. Nothing wrong with that." He didn't press, didn't ask where the boy came from or how long he'd been alone. He knew enough about silence to recognize when it was the only thing holding a child together. A gust of wind rattled the windows. Outside, a horse whinnied. Thunder's mare, the chestnut with the white blaze, waited patiently at the post, head bowed, her breath rising in slow curls of mist. Then the door burst open. The wind rushed in first, scattering the smell of stew and smoke. And then came Margaret O'Sullivan, her cheeks flushed from the cold, hair loosened from its neat tie, strands whipping around her face. Her coat was dusty from the road, her lantern still burning weakly in her hand. She looked around the room once, her eyes wide and wild with worry, until they landed on the boy. "Emmett!" The name tore out of her like a sob. She crossed the room in a heartbeat, the lantern swinging wildly as she dropped to her knees beside him. Her arms went around the boy before he could stand, and the sound she made was half relief, half disbelief. "I thought I'd lost you," she whispered. "I thought—" Thunder rose slowly, removing his hat with a quiet respect. "Ma'am," he said, voice steady but gentle. "I found him by the store. He was hungry. Just thought I'd get him a meal." Margaret's gaze darted from the boy to the man, still clutching Emmett's shoulder protectively. Her breath came fast, chest rising and falling beneath her coat. For a moment, she looked ready to fight, as if the world had taken too much already, and she was done letting it. Then her expression softened. The cowboy before her didn't look cruel or cunning, just tired, like someone who'd known the same kind of hunger, the same kind of cold. "Thank you," she said finally, voice trembling. "I didn't think anyone would—" She stopped herself, unable to finish. Thunder gave a small nod, resting his hat against his chest. "No thanks needed. Boy just looked like he needed a warm place for a night." Margaret's eyes searched his face. "You're not from around here?" "No, ma'am," Thunder said. "Got a ranch north of town. Just passing through, maybe staying a while." "Hard to say." She straightened, still holding on to Emmett's shoulder. The boy leaned closer to her, his eyes wet, ashamed and relieved all at once. "I'm sorry, Miss O'Sullivan," he mumbled. "I didn't mean to run. I just—" She pressed a hand gently against his hair. "Hush, child. You're safe now." The room had gone quiet. Even Mabel, the innkeeper, a round woman with kind eyes and sleeves rolled to her elbows, paused behind the counter, wiping her hands on her apron, watching the strange little reunion unfold. Thunder placed a few coins on the table, enough for the meal and then some. "The boy's got nowhere to stay tonight," he said quietly. "Neither of you, from the looks of it." Margaret's hand stilled. "What are you saying?" Thunder took a slow breath, his tone calm, measured, like a man thinking out loud. "Got a ranch up north, 2 spare beds, good roof, plenty of work that needs doing. The boy needs a place to sleep, and you." He hesitated, meeting her eyes. "You look like you could use a place too." Margaret's brows drew together. "You'd take him in." Thunder's gaze flicked toward the boy, then back to her. "Both of you." He said it simply, like a fact, not a favor. "He needs a home. You need work. And I—" He paused, adjusting his hat in his hands. "I could use a company that ain't the wind." The words hung between them, soft but heavy, like dust after a storm. Emmett looked from one to the other, wide-eyed, sensing something shifting beyond his understanding. Margaret swallowed hard. There was something in her expression. Gratitude, yes, but also fear. A woman alone in a man's world couldn't afford to trust easily. Her life, her reputation, her safety, all of it had been built on careful distance. And yet, standing there in the warmth of that dimly lit room, she saw something in Thunder's eyes that wasn't pity. It was steadiness, something she hadn't felt in a long time. Her voice broke the silence, soft as the lantern's flame between them. "If I go," she said, her hand tightening on Emmett's shoulder, "I'll be risking everything." Thunder's gaze didn't waver. "Sometimes that's the only way to start over." The boy looked up at them both, not quite understanding the weight of what had just passed between them, only knowing that for the first time, the night didn't feel so cold. Outside, the wind pressed against the windows, carrying the faint scent of rain, the promise of a storm, or maybe the beginning of something new. Dawn arrived softly over Sweetwater Creek, the sky painted in pale amber and rose. The first light caught the frost on the sagebrush and turned it silver. The world felt hushed, like the land itself was holding its breath for something new to begin. 3 riders moved slowly along the dirt trail. Thunder Davidson, his chestnut mare, steady beneath him. Margaret O'Sullivan, her posture upright but untrained on the small bay gelding Thunder had saddled for her. And Emmett Rowe, perched carefully on the back of a smaller gray pony, his thin legs gripping awkwardly but determinedly. Thunder rode ahead, his silhouette broad against the rising sun, coattails brushing the air behind him. He didn't speak much, didn't have to. The rhythm of hooves against the hard-packed earth said enough. Dust followed them in a long, drifting line, catching the light like old ghosts. Every so often, Thunder turned in his saddle to check on the 2 behind him. Margaret would nod when their eyes met, her face still pale from the sleepless night, but her chin set with quiet resolve. By mid-morning, the plains opened wide before them, endless grass bending in the wind, a horizon so far it looked like the edge of forever. The sun climbed higher, and Emmett squinted beneath his brimless hat, his hair shining gold in the light. He hadn't spoken since they left town, but his small hands clung tightly to the reins. Thunder noticed and slowed his pace, letting the boy's pony draw even with his mare. "Doing all right back there?" he asked. Emmett nodded, though his lips were cracked and dry. "I ain't scared," the boy said softly. "Didn't figure you were," Thunder replied, and for the first time that morning, he smiled. Margaret's voice drifted through the wind. "How far to your ranch?" she asked, steady but breathless. "A few hours yet," Thunder said, glancing at the sun. "We'll rest by Willow Creek come nightfall." He didn't add that the place had been his favorite spot for years, where the water ran clear and the stars seemed close enough to touch. As the day wore on, silence settled over them again, heavy but not unfriendly. Margaret's skirt brushed against the stirrup leather, her fingers gripping the reins too tightly. She had never ridden long distances before, but pride kept her upright. Each bump on the trail reminded her of how far she was from everything she'd once known. The orphanage, the safety of walls, the rules that had felt like chains. She looked ahead at the man leading them, his shoulders squared, his movements deliberate. There was something about him that made the vastness of the plains feel less empty. By afternoon, the air shimmered with heat. They passed a herd of wild mustangs in the distance, dark shapes moving like smoke across the horizon. Emmett gasped, his eyes wide, and Thunder chuckled under his breath. "Free ones," he said quietly. "No fence could ever hold them." The boy smiled faintly, as if the thought of freedom was something he was only just beginning to understand. When the sun began to sink, painting the sky in copper and crimson, they reached the banks of Willow Creek. The water glimmered through the reeds, cold and clean. Thunder dismounted first, tying his mare to a low branch, then helped Margaret down. She stumbled slightly, her legs stiff from the ride, and he steadied her with a calloused hand. "You'll get used to it," he said gently. She managed a tired laugh. "If I survive the first week," she replied, brushing the dust from her skirt. Emmett ran straight to the creek, kneeling to scoop water into his palms. Thunder unpacked the saddlebags and set about building a small fire. He worked with quiet precision, gathering dry twigs, striking the flint, coaxing the flames until they caught. Margaret watched him, the orange glow flickering across his face, the lines deepened by both age and kindness. When the fire burned steady, they ate from a tin pot of beans and bread Thunder had brought along. No one spoke much. The sound of crackling wood and the soft rush of water filled the silence. Overhead, the first stars appeared, scattered across the darkening blue like old secrets. It was Margaret who finally broke the quiet. Her voice was low, hesitant, the words almost lost to the wind. "Why did you stop for him?" Thunder didn't look up right away. He poked the fire with a stick, sending sparks into the air. "Because once," he said, "somebody stopped for me." His tone was slow, steady, the way a man talks when remembering something that mattered. He told them about Joseph Mackenzie, an old rancher he'd met years ago when he was no older than Emmett. Thunder had been starving then too, caught stealing bread from a wagon outside a saloon. "He could have turned me in," Thunder said, eyes distant reflecting the firelight. "But he didn't. He just looked at me and said, 'If a man's that hungry, what he needs ain't punishment. It's supper.' He gave me work, a bed in the barn, and for the first time, I belonged somewhere." Margaret listened in silence, her hands folded in her lap. Thunder's voice softened as he went on. "When he got sick, I sat by him every night. Before he passed, he told me one thing. 'Pass the kindness on, son. That's how the world keeps turning.'" Thunder paused, watching the flames bend and snap. "I reckon I've been trying to do that ever since." The fire popped loudly, scattering a few sparks into the cool night. Margaret turned her face slightly away, but the light caught the shimmer of tears at the corners of her eyes. She didn't speak, just stared into the fire, as if seeing her own choices reflected there. All the moments she had stood against cruelty, even when it cost her. Thunder looked at her for a long moment, then down at the sleeping boy beside the fire. Emmett's breathing had slowed, his face soft in the firelight, a half-smile forming in sleep. The sound of the creek nearby blended with the rustle of the willows, and for the first time in years, Thunder felt the quiet wasn't lonely. Margaret finally said, barely above a whisper, "You make it sound simple." Thunder smiled faintly. "Ain't simple," he said, "just right." The night deepened. The fire sank low, glowing red against the stones. Thunder leaned back on his saddle roll, watching the stars glimmer through the shifting branches. Margaret lay beside Emmett, one arm resting protectively across the boy's chest. The world had gone still. No wind, no sound, but the steady breath of the sleeping and the slow song of the water. Then, in the hush of it all, Emmett stirred. His lips moved, and a single word slipped out, half dream, half memory. "Pa?" Thunder froze. The sound hit him like a stone thrown into still water, rippling through every part of him. He looked toward the boy, then at Margaret, who lay motionless, eyes closed but awake. For a long moment, Thunder said nothing. The word hung there, fragile and unfinished, as if one wrong breath could break it. And, as the wind returned, soft, carrying the scent of rivergrass and ash, Thunder realized he didn't know whether to correct the boy or let the word stand. Morning came softly after the night at Willow Creek. The first streaks of light spilled over the hills, golden and calm, and the sound of horses stamping near the creek rose with the dawn. By the time the sun cleared the ridge, 3 riders were on the move again, their shadows stretching long behind them as they rode north through a valley lined with cottonwoods. The air was clean and full of promise, carrying the faint scent of wet earth and grass after the night dew. Margaret rode silently, her skirt catching the morning breeze. Emmett hummed tunelessly behind her, half asleep in the saddle, and Thunder, steady as ever, led the way toward a place that had waited for years without laughter. When the trail curved and the land opened wide, the ranch appeared below them, a small wooden cabin tucked between rolling green hills, smoke curling gently from a stone chimney. The corral stood nearby, its rails worn but sturdy, and a few cattle grazed lazily in the pasture. It wasn't grand or proud. It was quiet, weathered, and patient, like the man who had built it. Thunder slowed his mare and looked back at them with a faint smile. "Welcome home," he said simply. Margaret's eyes swept across the land. It wasn't much, yet there was something sacred about it, as if it had been waiting for hands like hers to stir it awake. The cabin itself leaned slightly, patched in places with old timber, but when Thunder pushed open the door, a wave of warmth met them. Faint wood smoke, the memory of past fires, and the hush of solitude long endured. Inside stood a rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, a stone hearth, and a bed frame Thunder had clearly made himself. No curtains, no softness, just usefulness and silence. "It's not fancy," Thunder said, rubbing the back of his neck, "but it's dry in the rain, warm in the winter, and quiet enough to hear your own thoughts." Margaret stepped inside and touched the edge of the table. "It's honest," she murmured, "and that's worth more than fancy." That first week, the house began to change. Margaret brought order where there had been dust. She found scraps of fabric in Thunder's old trunks and sewed curtains that fluttered in the breeze. She scrubbed the floors, baked bread until the smell filled the cabin, and coaxed flowers to bloom near the porch. Thunder, unused to such things, found himself standing in the doorway more than once, watching her work with a mix of confusion and quiet awe. It wasn't that she made the house prettier. She made it alive. Emmett, too, began to bloom. Thunder took him out every morning after chores, teaching him how to ride and rope, how to mend a fence, and how to read the wind. The boy's laughter echoed through the hills, chasing away the years of silence that had settled there. In the evenings, when the light turned soft and the air smelled of hay, Margaret would sit by the fire with her mending, while Thunder leaned back in his chair, pipe in hand, and listened to Emmett read from a book they'd found in town. His voice was slow, uncertain at first, but stronger each night. Sometimes Thunder would glance toward Margaret, the firelight painting her face in gold and shadow, and something would tighten in his chest, something unnamed, something he hadn't felt since before the trail had worn him down. She would catch him looking now and then, and though she said nothing, the corners of her mouth would curve in that knowing, almost shy way. As the days passed, their lives began to move in rhythm. Morning chores, midday rides, evenings by the hearth. The quiet between them was no longer lonely. It was full, warm, alive, yet beneath it all, something unspoken lingered, a tenderness that hovered just beyond words. One evening, the sky turned amber and deep blue as the sun slipped low across the hills. Margaret stood on the porch, a dish towel still in her hands, watching the light fade. Thunder joined her, his steps heavy but unhurried. They stood side by side, the wind lifting the edges of her hair, the air cool and still. Down in the field, Emmett was trying to throw a lasso around a fence post, laughing each time he missed. "He's thriving," Margaret said softly, her eyes on the boy. Thunder smiled, resting one hand against the porch post. "Because of you," he said. She turned to him, half surprised. "And what about you?" she asked quietly. He studied her for a moment, the dying sunlight catching in his eyes. "You're stubborn as the day is long," he said, a hint of a smile in his voice. "And every morning I thank the Lord for it." She laughed then, a sound soft and bright, carried off by the wind. Thunder chuckled too, shaking his head, and for a moment they both stood smiling like old friends who had found a piece of peace they didn't know they were missing. But then the laughter faded, replaced by silence, not awkward, not uncertain, just deep. The space between them seemed to hum with everything left unsaid, the gratitude, the fear, the quiet pull of hearts that had forgotten how to reach out. Thunder turned, meeting her gaze fully now. The wind stilled, Margaret's breath caught, and for the first time since she'd left the orphanage, she didn't think of what was proper or safe. She thought only of the man who had opened his door to her when he didn't have to. When their lips met, it wasn't sudden or hurried. It was gentle, certain, like a promise spoken without words. His hand brushed her cheek. Hers trembled slightly as it rested against his chest. The air seemed to hold still. Even the crickets outside had gone quiet. Then, somewhere in the distance, the sound came. Low, rolling, familiar. Thunder. Real thunder. The sky flickered faintly at the horizon, and a soft wind began to rise, carrying the scent of rain across the fields. Thunder pulled back slowly, his eyes lifting toward the gathering clouds. Margaret followed his gaze, a small, knowing smile on her lips. "A storm's coming," she said quietly. He nodded, his hand still resting over hers. "Always does," he murmured. And, as the first drops began to fall, pattering softly against the porch roof, they stood there together, the cowboy, the teacher, and somewhere beyond the field, the boy who'd finally found laughter again, waiting for the rain to begin. By the time autumn turned to winter, the valley had gone silent. The cottonwoods stood bare against a sky of iron, and frost coated every fence post in pale silver. The laughter that once filled the ranch was now muffled under the steady breath of snow. Days shortened into hours of gray light, and nights stretched endlessly, broken only by the crackle of the fire inside the cabin. Still, within those wooden walls, there was warmth, the kind that came from bread baking, from laughter shared, from the quiet certainty that love had finally found its place. But winter came cruel and hard. The storms rolled in without mercy, wind howling like some hungry spirit over the plains. Snow piled high along the fences, heavy and wet, swallowing paths and tracks alike. Thunder Davidson rose early every morning, his breath a white cloud in the cold air, his movements slower now, but steady. He checked the livestock, chopped wood, and made sure Margaret and Emmett stayed warm. His mare, the chestnut with the white blaze, waited at the gate each dawn, her breath steaming, her patience matching her rider's. One morning, just as the wind began to pick up again, a knock came at the door. Henry Talbot, a neighbor from across the ridge, stood there with snow on his hat and desperation in his eyes. "Cattle broke loose in the storm," he said, voice shaking. "They've gone down toward the frozen creek. I can't find half of them. If I don't bring them back, I'll lose everything." Thunder looked at the window where the snow fell thick and slanting. "I'll ride with you," he said simply. Margaret turned from the hearth, her face tightening with worry. "It's near whiteout out there," she warned. Thunder smiled faintly, his expression calm, the kind that always carried quiet reassurance. "I'll be back by nightfall," he promised, pulling on his coat. He brushed a kiss across her forehead and squeezed Emmett's shoulder. "Keep that fire burning, partner." By noon, the wind had risen to a scream. The world outside the cabin vanished in a whirl of white. Margaret stood at the window, her reflection faint in the frost, her hands gripping the sill until her knuckles whitened. The clock ticked, slow and steady. Emmett tried to read aloud, but his voice trembled, and finally he stopped. "He'll come back," Margaret said softly, though her voice sounded like a prayer more than certainty. Night fell without him. The snow showed no mercy. Drifts piled against the door, and the trees groaned under the weight of ice. Margaret kept the fire alive, feeding it every hour. She set a lamp by the window, its glow small and steadfast against the storm. "He said by nightfall," she whispered to herself. "He always keeps his word." Hours passed. Then, sometime past midnight, a faint sound broke through the wind, the jingle of spurs. Margaret froze, her heart pounding. She threw open the door, and a rush of cold tore through the cabin. There, slumped against the porch rail, was Thunder. His coat was crusted with ice, his hat gone, his hair dusted white. "Thunder!" she cried, rushing to him. Emmett was beside her in an instant, his small hands pulling at the frozen fabric. Together they dragged him inside, the heat from the fire rising in waves. Thunder's skin was pale, his lips blue, but when Margaret pressed a blanket around him, his eyelids fluttered open. A weak smile touched his mouth. "I told you," he whispered, voice barely a breath. "I'd always come home." Margaret's tears fell freely, landing on his gloved hands. Emmett pressed close, his face buried against Thunder's arm. Outside, the wind still raged, but inside the small cabin, time seemed to stop. The world reduced to warmth, breath, and the fragile miracle of return. By morning, the storm had passed. The snow lay deep but glittered under the new sun like glass. The chestnut mare stood near the barn, tired but alive, her flank streaked with frost. Thunder slept for a full day and night, and when he finally rose, his color had returned, his strength slow but steady. He didn't speak much about the storm, only said that the cattle had been found and Henry had made it home. "We all made it home," he said, and looked at Margaret when he did. Spring came slowly but surely. The hills turned green again, and the creek sang louder each morning. The ranch seemed to breathe anew. Fences mended, gardens blooming, laughter returning to the walls. One bright morning, Thunder took Emmett into town. When they came back, Margaret found a folded paper in her husband's hand, a legal document signed and stamped. Thunder knelt before Emmett, his eyes gentle and proud. "You're my son in every way that matters," he said. The boy's eyes widened, and for a heartbeat, he didn't speak. Then he threw his arms around Thunder's neck and whispered, "Pa." This time, Thunder didn't freeze. He only smiled, holding the boy close. Months later, the cabin filled with the soft cries of a newborn. Margaret, pale but glowing, held their daughter in her arms, the tiny bundle wrapped in a quilt she'd sewn from the same fabric as the curtains. Thunder sat beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder, Emmett hovering close, eyes wide with wonder. "We'll call her Hope," Margaret said, her voice trembling, "because that's what she brought us." The seasons turned again. One golden evening, the family stood on the porch, the fields stretching wide under a warm sky. Emmett, taller now, stood at the railing, reading aloud from the same old book, his voice clear and steady. Margaret leaned against Thunder's chest, the baby asleep in her arms, her hair catching the last light of day. She smiled softly and whispered, "Remember what the boy said that night? Nobody cares." Thunder looked down at her, his face calm, his arm firm around her shoulders. He pressed a kiss to her hair. "And I said, 'I always care,'" he murmured. "Still do." The sun dipped behind the hills, painting the land in gold and shadow. The wind carried the faint smell of rain, and somewhere in that stillness, beyond the fences, beyond the fields, the promise hung in the air like a heartbeat that never fades. I care always. Sometimes, a single word can change an entire life. Amid dust and loneliness, three lost souls found each other, bound by a simple promise. And when the winter finally passed, they had more than a home. They had rediscovered something far greater, the belief that kindness can still save the world, one person at a time. This story reminds us that love doesn't always arrive through grand gestures. Sometimes it takes the shape of patience, of bread shared across a worn wooden table, or of a quiet voice whispering, "You're not alone." Because in the end, genuine care, simple and steadfast, is what keeps this world warm, even through its coldest hours. And there will always be room for what is good. If this story touched something in your heart, I'd love to hear from you. Share in the comments where you're watching from and what kindness means to you. And if you'd like to journey with me through more tales of love and hope, subscribe and stay for a while. Thank you for being here, and may your evening be peaceful.